Thank you. And thanks to the organizers for this absolutely fantastic event. So this short presentation draws on my desk-based meta-study on climate-related human mobility and adaptation outcomes in Bangladesh. My study reaffirmed the frequently repeated arguments that both climate-related mobility and adaptation outcomes are highly contextual. That's probably a narrative we're all familiar with. However, perhaps more interestingly, my analysis shed light on important commonalities across various contexts, and those commonalities will be the focus of my presentation today. So we'll start with a simple and hopefully non-controversial definition of vulnerability, a working definition, and that is susceptibility, often socioeconomic, to the negative impacts of climate variability and change. A key finding from my data set was that although specific instances of vulnerability were often successfully addressed via human mobility, for example, the adverse effects of water salinization would be mitigated through relocation. But vulnerability itself, or to use Lucy's word, precarity, was rarely resolved. And what I mean by that is that typically for communities and individuals, many of the pre-mobility vulnerabilities described in the data set continued and were often exacerbated by the mobility. And new vulnerabilities developed as well. So thus, overall vulnerability and precarity often worsened over time. So my data set consisted of 36 articles published over a 5-year period that met my selection criteria, which were Bangladesh-based field research articles published in peer-reviewed journals and indexed in the CliMig database. And a helpful design figure of my study turned out to be the decision to focus on all climate-related mobilities and immobilities, not simply one type of mobility or pathway, such as rural to urban migration. And so that decision helped ensure a more contextually rich data set, one that covered multiple eco-geological contexts and climate events, field studies done on sending locations as well as receiving locations, and the full plurality of climate mobilities. So through qualitative content analysis and employing subsumption to build my coding frame, I identified a broad range of socioeconomic factors that influence mobility. These range from economic factors such as livelihoods and access to resources to non-economic factors such as social capital, health, and gender dynamics. And I categorized these according to whether they were supportive of mobility aspirations or burdensome to mobility aspirations. And so here we can see the percentage of studies in the data set that mention factors which were either supportive and enabling of mobility aspirations or burdensome and inhibiting to them. So nearly all of the articles in the data set reported extensively on burdensome or inhibiting factors. For supporting / enabling factors, these were often mentioned as exceptions to a more general rule. And significantly, nearly all of the mobilities in the data set were autonomous, that is, undertaken without humanitarian or government support. So I also coded data on mobilities according to the extent to which they were undertaken voluntarily or involuntarily, and plotted that data along a continuum. You'll see the categories I used and the number of mobility descriptions that fit each category criteria. And so the majority of mobilities reported in the data set fell on the forced or involuntary side of the spectrum. And so that leads me to some findings, similar to what Lucy talked about. Really, the socioeconomic vulnerability was present and consequential to mobility aspirations at all stages of the mobility cycle. Second, and not surprisingly, erosive coping and maladaptation were commonplace. Though there were some examples of specific instances where exposure and vulnerability were successfully addressed through mobility, such vulnerabilities and exposures were often replaced by others in what Patricia Schwertl refers to as a risk exchange. So third, mobilities in the data set were generally not aspirational. They were involuntary, they were autonomous, and therefore rarely adaptive. And finally, there was a scarcity of supportive mobility pathways available, and that was a big part of the problem. In other words, when people were forced to leave, they rarely had few good places to go, though there are initiatives in Bangladesh underway to address this. So allow me some final takeaways. First, the well-rehearsed narrative around migration as adaptation is problematic, particularly when applied to the involuntary and autonomous mobilities of marginalized communities. Second, human mobility remains insufficiently problematized. Perhaps it is even depoliticized through the language we use. That's certainly true when we call displacement climate migration. But what about when we default to the term human mobility and fail to call out mobilities that are forced? So mobility, as in the study of human mobility, is an important lens, but it is just a lens. It is a lens into the deeper economic, social, and political dynamics that affect well-being. So if the goal is to reduce forced mobilities and support climate adaptation, then the socioeconomic drivers of vulnerability must be called out and addressed. Thank you.